With over 1,000 solo episodes, today's guest has been able to use those episodes to create and publish a book. Now, we have definitely talked about ways that as a podcaster, you can monetize your podcast. And one of those ways is by turning that content into a sellable book. But I don't think we've actually talked to anyone who's done that. Today, our guest, Scott, has done that. Scott has produced over 1,500 episodes for his own podcast, and hearing him talk about how he had a very high cadence in the beginning and then was able to shift that cadence based on his life and what needed to happen during that time in his life was very eye-opening and also allows me to really push you guys that you don't have to do a weekly show. You don't have to have a podcast that's every single day. You can choose what is going to work best for you, and you're allowed to change that. If you are someone who is considering having a book based on the solo episodes from your podcast, this episode is definitely for you. Hello, Scott. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I'm very excited to chat with you. 1,400 episodes is no small feat. So if you could start by telling everyone who you are, what you do, and about your podcast.
Absolutely. So my name is Scott Maderer. I am a full-time coach. I've been full-time coaching since 2017. Before that, I've done a lot of different things. I actually started my career. Got a couple of degrees in hard sciences. I was going to be a medical researcher. Started down that road, figured out that medical research work is about 90% chasing grant money and about 10% actually doing research work. And so I'm like, don't really want to do that the rest of my life. So I pivoted. I became a school teacher. I taught middle school and high school science. I've also done adult ed and done a lot of systemic reform and different things in the science education field. Eventually got burned out on school teaching. I loved teaching. I loved the kids. I loved, pouring into the kids and lifting them up. But at the same time, for anyone that knows a teacher, it's low pay, long hours, a lot of emotional energy draining, that kind of thing. So I pivoted from that again and I worked for a company called Educational Testing Service. So they write tests for a living. In the words of my students, I joined the dark side. I went from teaching to testing, So, but really and truly testing, there's good things about it and bad things about it, just like everything else. But I began to work in that industry. I worked my way up to a senior position. I had about 20 leaders that reported to me, had a team of about 180 people that reported up through them. Doing a lot of client work on planes all the time, in hotel rooms all the time, flying around the country, working on very large state-based testing projects. And again, I loved what I did. I especially loved pouring into the other leaders that worked for the company. But there were also things about it that I didn't like and didn't enjoy, like, being away from, my wife and my kid for 3 or 4 months out of the year because I was in a hotel room somewhere. It's like, I tell everybody, it's like, get to go to see wonderful cities and see nothing but airports and hotel rooms, travel work, that's what it is. The highlight of the trip is like, hey, we went to a good restaurant, that's what you're writing home about. So doing all of that stuff and that got old. So I literally decided to reverse my climb up the corporate ladder. I started a coaching business on the side. I've always been entrepreneurial. Started my first business when I was 12 or 13 years old. Kind of always had something going on the side when I was a teacher, had something going on the side when I was in corporate. So I started this coaching business because I had noticed that that's kind of the part of teaching and part of corporate that I really enjoyed, was that engaging with, mentoring, lifting up, bringing other people along. And so I'm like, well, coaching, that's a perfect way to do that. So I started doing that mainly in the financial realm. I started that in 2011, and then I went full time with that in 2017. I started my podcast January 8th of 2018, and that really was the why. I started the podcast as a way of doing two things. One was reaching out to others in the community. Two was getting my own kind of ideas out there. But also, I'm a verbal processor. I hate writing. So I'm like, I'm not going to write a blog. I'm not going to do all of that. Just stick a microphone in front of my face. I'll talk, and that was a podcast. So I launched that podcast. I decided I'd do it for 6 months and see whether or not I liked it. I haven't figured out the answer yet, so I'm still doing it. But eventually I'll figure out that I don't like it or I like it, and then we'll see if I commit to it or not. So that's a little bit about me and kind of what brought me here.
I want to touch on the teaching side for a second because as podcast hosts, we are teaching our audience things. And so, what are some things that maybe you've seen? And obviously, we're going to get into a lot of other things during this conversation, but you're having that history. I really want to ask you this question. What are some things that podcast hosts could do better to teach? Where because they don't
Mhm.
have that teaching background. They don't have that background of being able, especially adult learners are very, very different than teaching children things. So what are maybe one or two things that you see podcast hosts do wrong in teaching people that they could do better at?
I'll qualify one thing you said. I'm not going to use the word wrong because I don't think there's a quote right or wrong way. I think a lot of times what we do will engage or disengage more people. So it's
Mm,
less about, are you doing it right? Because here's the thing, the wrongest quote unquote teacher out there, there's somebody that was like, that's the best teacher I've ever had.
yeah.
It just, we're all too different. We're wired too different. We think too differently for me to generalize and say it's quote, always bad. But at the same time, what I think a lot of it is the frame that we take on. So I think a lot of us, when we think about teaching and education, we think about ourselves being the expert. And my job is to download this expert knowledge I have in my head into someone else's brain so that they now know everything that I know. And the truth is, that's not really what good teaching looks like in most cases. That's not what
Mm,
engaging teaching looks like in most cases. Think about it. You've been the receiver of somebody else was the expert, and now they're just trying to cram all this stuff into your head. And generally it may work, you may get it, but it's not fun. It's not
right.
engaging, it's not entertaining, it's kind of painful. So I think instead, if we take that frame of mind of, we're not here to dump information out, we're here to have a conversation. Now it's a little weird because if you're doing a solo episode, you're having a conversation into a vacuum,
Right.
but you kind of almost have to position yourself with what are the questions my listener would be asking? What are they thinking? If I say this, what would be the natural thing that they'd say? Yeah, but what about this? Or
Mm,
now what? And begin to build that into the episodes as you do them. Now, it's a lot easier if you're doing an interview based podcast because you actually have another human being there and you can actually have a conversation. But even there, I think a lot of times as a host, we want to kind of engage as still positioning ourselves as the expert as opposed
mhm.
to almost taking on that role of the listener and going, what would be the next obvious thing that they'd want to know? What would be the next question that they want to hear an answer to? What's the obvious next thing? And that's hard to do even in an interview. And I would not claim to do it perfectly myself, but it is something that I think after, I've got almost 500 interviews under my belt now. I've gotten a lot better at it today. Don't go back and listen to the first couple of interviews. They're not nearly as good. I think every podcaster will tell you that. It's like, I'd love you to download all of them so that I get the credit for the download, but please don't listen to them.
Yeah.
Or at least don't judge me based on those.
Yes, exactly. 100%. I mean, I have my very first podcast. I started in 2018. You can't find that anywhere. Like it is not
Well, mine are
around.
still up. I've left them all up. I'll live with the fact that they're out there. It's okay.
So, what did that cadence look like for you when you first started the podcast? Now, you had just moved away from your full time job. You were doing this full time. So, you probably had a little more space than, the hobby podcast or the person who's maybe doing it on the side. But what did that cadence look like as you have gone? Because I don't think that equates 52 weeks equates to that many episodes within this time frame. Or was it like, were there times where you did three a week, or what did that look like?
So what I actually started with is I was doing something a little unusual. So the first thing I did is I would interview people. I would do a 2 hour interview block. So I would schedule an interview with you. I would say, hey, I need 2 hours of your time. But I actually created in that 2 hours 4 separate episodes that would end up being about 20 to 30 minutes each. So we recorded everything, but I themed the questions kind of by topic, by day. Invest in yourself, invest in others, develop your influence, and impact the world. So those were kind of the 4 segments that I did. So I would record a single interview, but that was 4 episodes worth of content. I would release those on 4 sequential Mondays. The rest of the week on Tuesday, I did kind of a faith based kind of episode. And then on Wednesdays, I did an episode about time. On Thursdays, I did an episode about talent. And on Friday, I did an episode about treasures or financial, because that's the three areas as a coach that I work with people in. And so every week there was an interview on Monday, and then a Tuesday, a Wednesday, a Thursday, and a Friday episode. Eventually, I started getting enough requests to be on the show from interviews that I added a Saturday night episode that I would release that was also an interview, but it was standalone. It was a 45-minute single episode. And I was testing that out to see how I liked that. I called those my Saturday night specials. So, so those would come out
Love
on
it.
Saturday. And so now I'm doing, 6 days a week and all of those are coming out. And eventually I pivoted and kind of got away from doing the longer episode that I divided into 4 and just moved the Saturday episode to be a Monday episode. I'm still at that point now doing it 5 days a week. And then I eventually cut down from that to now I release an episode or an interview on Monday, and then the other episode on Tuesday. So I'm really doing it too. Occasionally I'll release a bonus episode on like a Wednesday or something like that, but typically there's 2 episodes a week. So that cadence has obviously varied over time. The hardest thing when I first started was finding guests. I
Mhm.
think that is true for a lot of us that do interview based. For me, what I found is I actually made some contacts and made some friends with some publishers and some
Mhm.
folks that were in the media realm. And it turns out that people that write books like to go out promote those books. And so it was a way of, once I trained them and said, this is the kind of guest I'm looking for. This is who's perfect for me. I'd sometimes get 3, 4 of those a month from various publishers. Hey, we've got so-and-so, their book's coming out in a couple of months. Would you be interested in having them? And so that helped. And now there's services like Podmatch and others that do kind of make it a lot easier for us to find guests. But the hard part was the finding the guest. Once you found the guest, writing the questions, doing the interview, even editing, I got pretty quickly where I kind of had a system and a process. And I knew if I did an hour's worth of recording, then I had to spend at least about another hour to hour and a half doing some edit, putting social media together, promotion, that kind of thing. But that meant for, an hour worth of content, add 1.5 hours, and that's how much
Yeah.
time I could book out, and then I would knock it out. For a solo episode, I kept them short. They were about 30 minutes. So again, 30 minutes of work time, and then about 30 to 45 minutes of edit time. Boom, it's out there. So once I got a system up and running. Now, obviously, the very first episode I do, it took me like 5 times that to edit that. But
Yes.
eventually, pretty quickly, you get into a rhythm with it. The other area that I think a lot of folks struggle, because they look back at that and they're like, wait, you got like 1,400 episodes. I've only done about 500 interviews. That means I've done like 1,000 solo episodes. And they're like, well,
Yeah.
how do you do that without repeating yourself? And so that's the last tip that I did. For a long time, I still do. I have on my phone, I had on my computer, I had everywhere I went, I had a notes app basically that was strictly dedicated to anytime I saw anything that made me go, that's something I could talk about. Immediately captured that. Immediately put it into a database. Immediately put it into, I basically just used a simple spreadsheet. It's not like it has to be really complicated, but I'd write a few notes about so-and-so said this might make an interesting episode, or saw
Yeah.
this article, link, or whatever, anything I saw. So it's training your brain to just constantly be on the lookout for content, idea. And what I discovered is once I kind of, again, got my brain trained to do that, typical day, I've got 7 ideas for a podcast episode, and it's like worst case scenario, I'm releasing 1 episode. It's like most days I'm walking 6, 7, 8 ideas jotted down. I've got more ideas in the database that I haven't answered, or done an episode for. So it's training yourself to get that rhythm of constantly being looking for content, looking for ideas, looking for things I can talk about, things that I could riff off of, whatever it is.
Yeah. That is such a great idea. And I personally really love to capture all of my ideas because my brain, within 5 minutes, I'm like, whoop, next thing. Yeah.
It's like, I
Like
have a
most
brilliant
people.
idea. Wait, where do I, what was
Yeah.
it?
What are we talking about? Yeah. And so there are a few things that I personally do, and maybe this helps people as well. I have a Google phone number that I will text from my phone.
Hmm.
It's like my work number. And so I'll text it and it goes right to my email and it sends me myself an email. here's this idea, here's the link, or here are things you need to make sure that you do tomorrow, right? So that helps me kind of keep it top of mind once I get into my inbox. And then I also have my handy dandy shower notes, which sounds silly, but showers are the places where I get most of my ideas. And so it is a waterproof notepad. It is called Aqua Notes or something like that. It's got a pencil
Yep.
it comes
Aqua
with.
notes.
And I absolutely love that as just a way to, when I don't have my phone on me, be able to
Mhm.
capture those ideas, because those are usually where there's a lot more space and a lot more quiet to be able to process. Oh, wow, that happened today. Ooh, that's a good story. I should tell that one. So
Right.
I absolutely love that idea of capturing those. And I tend to recommend to people, you need to have at least 25 ideas of episodes you could do off the cuff in a list somewhere at all times.
Yep.
It helps if a guest cancels or if everything goes how it's not supposed to go, Mercury's in the microwave again, all of that fun stuff. Like, have something that you can easily pull from, that you're not scrambling trying to figure out, what am I going to talk about today?
Yeah.
That many
No, I
solo
agree with all of that.
episodes, though, is a lot. And so I'm even thinking about my own episodes where, I mean, I tend to find myself repeating certain elements, which I think is
Mhm.
important, right? And in reiterating core parts of our message and core things. But to be able to spin it in different ways every single time is absolutely incredible. And I do think that having that many episodes, and this is where we're kind of going with this conversation, has allowed you to have enough content to write a book using
Mhm.
those 1,000 solo podcast episodes. What did that process look like for you? I mean, we've mentioned it on the podcast as a way to monetize your show,
Yep.
taking that content from what you've talked about, showing up as the expert, and then being able to transition that into a book style. How did that idea kind of come to you? And then what did that beginning brainstorming process look like?
Yeah. So I think I mentioned earlier, I hate to write. So, it's like I've always wanted to write a book, but it's like I just don't like to sit down and write, which sounds ironic because literally large parts of my career over the years has involved writing,
Right.
and that's kind of why I think is because it was always work for me. It was always something I
Mm-hmm.
did as work. And so now it's like, well, I don't have to do it. I'm not going to do that. I don't have to do
Yeah.
that. Sound like a toddler. But there's a degree to which it's like I prefer to process auditorily and I do a better job with it. So let me lean into that natural strength. So it's kind of a combination of things. The first part was, going back to that idea capture mentality, because I kind of had some themes to the week in
Mm-hmm.
terms of what I was going to talk about. It did force me or constrain me to kind of look for ways of taking that topic. How do we use our time better? How do we get more productive? Which is a really broad topic. But then, okay, what can I spin about that today? What can I talk about that today? How can I take that topic and go into it? How do we get better with our money? How do we get better with our talent, our communication, our leadership, those sorts of areas? And so by having that constraint of a
Mm-hmm.
topic and yet also having that idea of, now let me produce content around there. What I began to notice, like you said, is there were some themes and some things that seemed to be core ideas that I kind of always came back to and maybe was just coming at it from a different angle or a different way. And then the other thing was that there were tools and tips and techniques I would share. I'd come across this new thing and I'd be like, hey, here's something y'all could try out. Here's something you could shift. And so by the time I had all this content, it then was a matter of sitting down with the list of every episode I'd produced. And, I was lucky in that I kept all of the records and had everything written down. And just I started going through it and kind of, okay, what are the core ideas? What are the core things? And from there, I began to produce an outline. Now, in my case, I did actually work with a coach. I'm a coach. I'm a firm believer in working with coaches. I worked with somebody who helped me massage that and kind of come through it and go, okay, well, you still need something here. There's not a good bridge between A and B. Do you have something here? And I'd either go find it because I already had it, or we'd jump on a call and we talk it through. And by the way, usually then I take that same topic and I turn it into an episode next
Yep.
week, and it's like, okay, here we go. So it would begin to fill in those gaps. And so by theming the content, because I think one mistake we make is if your podcast is just a shotgun where you're all over the place everywhere, Well, now it's hard to come back and, it's kind of like the blog where it's like every post is something different and then they turn that
Yeah.
into a book. Well, it's really just kind of a journal, that has a bunch of different disparate topics. But by pulling from there very selectively, I could take that 1,000 episodes and pull out, 200 that actually had a theme, had a context, fit into this idea that I wanted to get across. And that let me begin to put together. So the book is titled Inspired Living, and the subtitle is Assembling the Puzzle of Your Calling by Mastering Your Time, Your Talent, and Your Treasures. And so again, you'll notice those same themes
Mm-hmm.
showing up: time, talent, and treasures. You'll notice that idea of doing something and living in an inspired way. And so I could take stories that I'd had, I could take tools and tips that I had, I could take that kind of theme process and then begin to outline it. As well, it was what I'd been working with people as a coach. So I could take those real life examples of, and there's one of my clients is highlighted in the book. Actually, a couple of them are highlighted. One is highlighted by name. The rest of them are just more stories that I don't necessarily share the person's name or all of the details. But we talked through, this is how this couple applied this topic, and so
Yeah.
there's some real life examples that I was able to bring in through the coaching. So it's kind of pulling all those threads together, doing the organizational work of, what pieces fit where, putting that puzzle together, no pun intended. And then from there, I was able to work with somebody to help write and edit and publish. And so it's actually coming out July 2nd, 2024.
First of all, congratulations, because
Thank you.
very small percentage of people actually finish their book. And then an even smaller percentage actually get it out into the world. So congratulations that that is coming out. I'm thinking as you're talking, having had so many episodes, having talked through stories, examples since 2018,
Mm-hmm.
you have an entire life diary from there until now. And so if someone is like, oh man, I want to write a book or I want to talk about this, a podcast is a great way to get started, to be able to process, especially if you're an external processor like you and I are, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I also do not like to write. Don't ask me to write anything that's like a full length blog post. No, but I can take a podcast episode and turn that into a blog post.
Right.
Just got to speak it first. So to be able to externally process the stories, to even in the moment, like I'm thinking about my own stories that I've been able to share on the show, in the moment being able to tie it back to something else or to tie it forward to something
Mm-hmm.
else or refer back, oh, in that episode where we talked about this. There's just something extra special about having that documented that I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure allowed you to create that book a lot faster than you probably would have if you had to sit down and say, what are we going to write about today?
Yeah, I think, again, the joke is, everyone always, well, how long did it take you to write the book? And I'm like, well, from deciding I was going to put out a book to it's actually going to be in a bookstore somewhere was, 18, 19 months. But how long did it take me to write the book is 35 years,
Yeah.
because there's like life experience, there's ideas, there's things that I came up with that over years and years and decades and decades. And really, if you even just limit it to just the content, how long did it take me to write the book? Well, I started in 2018
Yeah.
because that's when I started talking, and putting things on paper and putting the ideas down and beginning to look for themes and patterns, and really even go back a little further. It started in 2011 because that's when I started coaching people and I started noticing patterns and go, hey, everyone's struggling. I started working just in money. And the reason I added productivity is because I started noticing that a lot of the same frames and mindsets and struggles that were holding us back when it came to money, turns out they're exactly the same as what holds us back when it comes to using our time and productivity. It's just
Mm,
a different kind of showing up in a different place.
yeah.
And the reason it is because at the end of the day, the way you handle your time and the way you handle your money is actually all about how you handle yourself. So my joke is I call myself a coach in time, talent, and treasures. Everyone comes to me for help with time or money. And then all I really ever do is work on talent, because at the end of the day, that's actually, that's where the solution is. And that's where the problem is. Right. So,
Yeah.
I wouldn't have discovered that. I would not have had that concept for a book without having done the work and the experience and the processing and the talking and the podcast and the coaching and all of those other pieces. So I think a lot of times the reason that we end up not producing the book that we have in our head is just that it's in our head. We're not doing anything. We're not taking those actions, whether it's coaching, whether it's mentoring others, whether it's volunteering somewhere, whether it's, doing
Mm.
something in your career, whether it's starting a podcast, whether it's writing a blog, whether it's doing a vlog, whether it's journaling, just capturing those things and wrestling with them so that it refines it. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait a minute, this is actually something that could help somebody else. I need to put this down there. And it becomes more of a drive to put it out than it is just this kind of vague idea of someday maybe I'll put this out there. I will warn you, it's kind of a bug. Once you've put one out, I'm already like working on the second one because it's like, it's like, well, this part didn't make it into the first part. So now I've got to turn that into another, yeah. So yeah, be careful. It is kind of addicting.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, I'm even thinking about as podcasters, we tend to, all right, we're speaking in front of a microphone, great, but we also get that external feedback, right? So if you want
Mhm.
to write a book, a podcast is a great place to start. What are people downloading? What are people responding to? What are people, sending you a DM about? That gives you a really good indication of what
Mhm.
people are getting from your show. Maybe you share episodes with clients and they come back with really valuable feedback. This gets you that instant response. Whereas if you write a book, you go through the publishing process. Even if you're self-publishing, it still takes time to get it out there and, circulating
Absolutely.
and get any type of response back. But a podcast allows you to do that pretty. Now, granted, some podcast listeners are just stalkers and they like to be quiet. We get that. A lot of the podcast listeners, they don't really like to interact. They're just here for the listens. But for those that do interact with you, it gives you that immediate feedback. Did you find that that helped you in guiding what was in the book and maybe what wasn't?
Absolutely. I'm a firm believer of, back to my science background, of running experiments and getting data.
Yeah.
I tend to frame things in that language of, it's not I succeeded or I failed. I just got information. And so if
Mm-hmm.
I put something out there that I think, wow, this is really cool and everyone's going to love this. And here's a download they can download and they're all going to, and crickets. Okay, good. Well, I thought it was cool,
Right. Good to
guess I'm the
know.
only one. Never mind. Good to know, and I don't need to spend a lot of time and energy on that anymore because it's not resonating with other people versus, okay, I put this content out and, I got a lot of downloads. I got engagement. People went, if I had a free resource they could download, people actually went and downloaded it. Whatever it is, I got an email from somebody. Oh, this helped me so much. Now, I will warn you, there are also, not only are there stalkers that don't engage, there are also trolls who just like to be mean
Right.
and tell you that everything's about your family of origin and, what you did last night that aren't true. So you do have to learn to ignore the haters and recognize that if one person sent you an email, that probably meant there were 1,000 people that could have sent you an email, but they didn't, because one kudo is really multiplied. Because trust me, there were a lot of people that were thinking it that didn't send the email. If
Right.
you don't believe that, just think about how many times you've emailed someone to tell them that something you read or something you heard was a great idea. And most of this, the answer's once,
Right.
twice, never, that
Oh, it
kind
was
of
my
thing.
friend.
Yeah, when you start a podcast, that's the other thing is, the first few episodes, right? It's like, well, I got 3 downloads, my wife, my mom, and me. That's
Yeah.
it. And those sorts of things. So you do have to be comfortable with the fact that for a while you're going to be putting things out into the void. Okay, that's okay because that's all the time to play and to do experiments and to test things and just see what starts to connect and what starts to resonate. And and then again, in my case, I had the lab of the coaching environment too, where I could work with a
Mm-hmm.
client. And if you run a small business, you've got employees, you've got clients, you've got other people, you can engage with them and just see, hey, is this content, is this idea, is this frame, is this topic, is it one that everyone kind of goes, oh great, they're talking about that again? Or is it one where they're like, hey, yeah, tell me more?
Mm-hmm.
Because that then gives you that instant feedback of where do you want to lean into, where do you want to get more, double down. more information. Now, obviously, you still want to guide it in terms
Yeah.
of, I don't just put out an episode just because other people want to listen to it. It's also got, I tell people I did the podcast for a lot of different reasons. I did it because I'm a verbal processor. I did it because I was testing out content. I did it to get introductions to people. Guess what? I have endorsements and I have a forward in my book, and I have people that, lended me like some of their time and put quotes in the book and stuff. Every single one of those people were people I met through the podcast.
Yeah.
The coach that worked with me as a coach that helped me get the publishing deal, I met him through the podcast. It's like every connection to that book, not just the content, but even incidental connections to the book came through the podcast. Because guess what? I use the podcast too to meet people and position myself to have a conversation, sometimes with people that rightfully there's no reason in the planet for them to have a conversation with me. But I have a show. Would you like to come on and promote your book? Or would you like to come on and talk about your topic du jour that you're an expert on, that you love talking about? All of a sudden, most people are like, yeah, I'd love to come on,
Yep.
and again, including people that at first glance, you're like, really? They said yes. When my podcast was still pretty tiny, I had a few people that are relatively big names, at least in the industry where I work, and we're willing to come on, willing to sit down, willing to talk, and then willing to promote it and do other things. That's really part of the beauty of podcasting, is it
Mm.
lets you leverage the content, it lets you leverage the connection, it lets you leverage that, all of that together, to end up, again, if you want to put a book out, having connections, having the people that can endorse the book, having the person that can write the forward, that, so that on the cover it says forward by New York Times bestselling author Dan Miller, which it does at the top of my book. Guess what? Somebody sees
Yep.
that and goes, oh, well, I like him. Maybe I'll
Mm-hmm.
like this book, even though I wrote the book, not him. But there's all of those connections that are secondary and incidental to the content that also add value from podcast to book.
Yeah. Podcasting is magical. And I mean, I know the listeners understand that. I wish more people understood it, that you really have to dig in though. Like, you're not
Mhm.
going to get this success overnight. You've been doing it for years. You fine tuned your strategy. You fine tuned getting the guests, figuring out what cadence worked for you. You didn't figure it out in a month or
Oh,
six
no.
months.
Well, again, I've done several different things even, I've got to different points. Like at this point, I want something different for my show than I wanted when I started out. So slowing
Yeah.
down and not releasing 6 episodes a week makes a lot more sense now. When I started out, man, more was good, put more. Now it's more like, no, I need some time in between to do these other things, like
Right.
go on your show and promote my book, and, go over there and do this other thing, and work with the clients that have hired me and do, that rhythm makes sense. So yeah, absolutely. Your rhythm changes, not just because you're experimenting and testing, but also just because your life changes. And so you're
Yeah.
going to have a different rhythm. But the truth is, podcasting allows you to do that because, to some extent, if you're consistent, that is really what most listeners want more than anything else.
Yeah.
They love the idea of, every Monday, I know I'm at least getting something from my favorite podcast this week, or every
Mm-hmm.
other week, or once a month, or whatever. And again, I've shifted that release schedule, but there's still that consistency and predictability of, hey, when I shift to this is what I'm going to do for a while. And now you kind of can count on that.
Yeah. Oh, Scott, this has been so incredible. Thank you so much for sharing all of your process and your journey in podcasting. Obviously, this is going to be out after your book goes live. So tell everybody where they can go purchase your book, maybe send you an email, right? And say how wonderful
Mhm.
this episode was and how much it impacted them, maybe something they learned. So, where can people find you, connect with you, and buy your book?
Absolutely. So I actually put together a special landing page just for your listeners. So if you go over to inspiredstewardship.com/listeners for your podcast. So
Mm-hmm.
inspiredstewardship.com/listeners, there's actually a page there. I've got some free resources that you're welcome to download. I've actually got a place on there where you can reach out and set up a time to chat if you just want to talk about anything you heard on the show. This isn't so I can sell you anything. It's literally just, if you've got questions or wanted to talk more about what we've talked about, set up a 30-minute time on my calendar. It's got a link for where you can go purchase the book from pretty much anywhere booksellers have it. That's literally the only thing on the page that'll cost money. It's got a link to my podcast. So if you'd like to check out some of the episodes, again, please don't go back to the most early ones and listen to them. You're welcome to do that. That's all linked up over there at inspiredstewardship.com/listeners.
Perfect. And we'll make sure that we have that linked in the YouTube description as well as in the show notes. That way, if anybody's driving or doing other things, they've got that link as well. Again, Scott, thank you so much. This has been so fun.
Absolutely. I've loved to be here, and I hope folks took away something from it that adds value.